October 31, 2005. Halloween night. Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. Teresa Halbach, a 25-year-old photographer, drove to the Avery salvage yard to photograph a van for Auto Trader magazine. It was a routine assignment that should have taken 20 minutes. Instead, it became the centerpiece of the most corrupt prosecution in modern American history. But here's what the prosecutors don't want you to know. The man they convicted of Teresa's murder was the same man who had just exposed their department as a cesspool of corruption. Steven Avery had spent 18 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit, and when DNA finally freed him in 2003, he filed a $36 million lawsuit that threatened to destroy the careers of the very cops who would later investigate Teresa's murder. What happened next wasn't justice. It was revenge dressed up in a badge. It was the systematic destruction of two men whose only crime was being poor, uneducated, and inconvenient to powerful people who needed them silenced. And the most horrifying part? They're still in prison today, victims of a frame-up so brazen, so documented, so obvious that it should terrify every American who believes in the promise of equal justice under law. This isn't just the story of Steven Avery and his intellectually disabled nephew Brendan Dassey. This is the story of how easily the system can destroy anyone when the people sworn to protect us decide you're the enemy. And by the time you hear what they did to these two men, you'll understand why this case didn't just shake Wisconsin, it shattered America's faith in justice itself. To understand the pure evil of what happened in 2005, you have to go back to 1985, when Steven Avery was first framed by the same corrupt system that would later frame him again. Penny Bernson was brutally assaulted while jogging on a Lake Michigan beach. She was traumatized, vulnerable, and desperate for justice. The Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department showed her a photo lineup, and she identified Steven Avery as her attacker. But here's what makes your blood boil. The cops knew Avery didn't do it. They had received multiple tips pointing to Gregory Allen, a known sex offender who perfectly matched the victim's description and had a history of assaulting women in the same area. Sheriff Tom Kukurek ignored these tips, buried the evidence, and let an innocent man rot in prison while the real rapist remained free to victimize other women. Steven Avery spent 18 years, the prime of his life, locked in a cage for a crime everyone knew he didn't commit. 18 years of his children growing up without their father. 18 years of his parents aging, wondering if they'd die before seeing their son free. 18 years while the real rapist continued attacking women because it was more convenient to keep an innocent man in prison than admit they were wrong. When DNA evidence finally freed Steven in 2003, the truth exploded like a bomb through Manitowoc County. Not only was Steven innocent, but Gregory Allen, the man they had ignored, had continued his reign of terror, assaulting multiple women while Steven sat in prison for his crimes. The civil rights lawsuit Steven filed in 2004 named Sheriff Tom Kukurek and District Attorney Dennis Vogel personally. $36 million in damages. Depositions that would expose decades of corruption. Career-ending revelations about a department rotten to its core. The powerful men of Manitowoc County faced a choice: admit their crimes and face justice, or find a way to destroy Steven Avery permanently. They chose destruction. October 31, 2005. Teresa Halbach had 3 appointments that day to photograph vehicles for Auto Trader magazine. Her last stop was the Avery salvage yard, where she was scheduled to meet Steven Avery at 2:30 p.m. Multiple witnesses saw Teresa arrive, take photos of the van, and interact normally with Steven. She left the property alive, heading toward her next appointment. Phone records show she was still making calls after leaving the Avery yard. But Teresa Halbach never made it home. On November 3rd, her worried family reported her missing. On November 5th, just 4 days later, her Toyota RAV4 was found on the Avery property by volunteer searchers. And here's where the story becomes absolutely chilling. The volunteer who found Teresa's vehicle was Pam Sturm, a private investigator with connections to law enforcement who was given a camera and directed to search the Avery property specifically. She walked directly to the vehicle in a 40-acre salvage yard filled with thousands of cars, as if she knew exactly where to look. Within hours, the same sheriff's department that Steven was suing for $36 million was swarming his property. The same cops who had framed him for rape were now investigating him for murder. The same corrupt system that had stolen 18 years of his life was about to take the rest of it. The fix was in before the investigation even began. What happened next should terrify every American who believes evidence doesn't lie. Because in Manitowoc County, evidence did whatever the corrupt cops needed it to do. The key that materialized: Steven Avery's bedroom was searched multiple times by multiple agencies. Nothing. Then, on the seventh search, conducted by the very officers who were named in Steven's lawsuit, Teresa's key suddenly appeared on his bedroom floor, with only Steven's DNA on it and none of Teresa's. A key that the victim carried daily, handled constantly, somehow had no trace of her DNA but was saturated with DNA from a man she barely knew. The bullet fragment that defied physics. Teresa was allegedly shot in Steven's garage. The garage was searched multiple times. No blood, no tissue, no bone fragments, no evidence of a shooting. Then, for months later, investigators found a single bullet fragment under Steven's workbench with Teresa's DNA on it. One bullet. In a garage that should have been a slaughterhouse if the prosecution's theory was correct. The blood that told a story. Steven's blood was found in Teresa's RAV4, but only in specific locations that made no sense if he had actually driven the vehicle. Drops near the ignition, but none on the steering wheel. Blood on the dashboard, but none on the gearshift. A pattern that suggested someone had planted blood from a vial, not bleeding from an actual person. And speaking of that blood vial, the evidence locker containing Steven's blood from his 1985 conviction had been opened. The vial had a broken seal and a small needle hole in the top. Someone had accessed that blood, and that someone had connections to law enforcement. The bones that migrated. Teresa's burned remains were found in 3 different locations: Steven's burn pit, his sister's barrel, and a quarry off the property. The prosecution claimed Steven burned her body in his backyard fire pit, but provided no explanation for how bones ended up miles away or why the burn pit showed no evidence of a fire hot enough to cremate a human body. Every piece of evidence told the same story. This wasn't a murder investigation, it was evidence plantation on an industrial scale. But the cruelest part of this frame-up wasn't what they did to Steven Avery, it was what they did to his 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey. Brendan was everything predators look for in a victim: intellectually disabled, trusting of authority, desperate to please adults, and completely unable to understand the consequences of his words. He had an IQ of 69, the reading level of a 4th grader, and the emotional development of a child half his age. The interrogators knew exactly what they had when they got Brendan alone in that room. No parent, no lawyer, no adult advocate. Just a scared boy who thought the nice police officers wanted to help him. The confession that was fed to him. Listen to those interrogation tapes, if you can stomach it. You'll hear investigators literally telling Brendan what to say, feeding him details about the crime, and manipulating his words to fit their narrative. "What did you do to her head?" they ask. Brendan guesses wildly. "Cut her hair." "What else?" they press. "Punch her." "What else?" "Come on, Brendan. Cut her." "What else?" Finally, exhausted and desperate to give them what they want, "Shot her." "Where?" "In the head." This wasn't a confession, it was coaching. It was psychological torture of a disabled child by trained manipulators who needed his words to prop up their crumbling case against Steven. The promises they made. They promised Brendan he could go back to school that day. They told him he wouldn't get in trouble if he just told them what they wanted to hear. They assured him they were trying to help him. Every single promise was a lie. Brendan Dassey has been in prison for nearly 20 years based on a confession that was extracted through psychological torture of a child. The trials of Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey weren't pursuits of truth. They were theatrical productions designed to hide the truth from a jury that was never told the full story. The conflict of interest. The Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, despite being defendants in Steven's $36 million lawsuit, was allowed to participate in the investigation. They found the key. They found the bullet. They had access to all the evidence that would later convict Steven. The very people with the most to lose from Steven's freedom were put in charge of investigating the crime that would send him away forever. The evidence they hid. The jury never heard about the broken seal on Steven's blood vial. They never heard about the multiple tips pointing to other suspects. They never heard about the investigators who had motive to frame Steven. They never heard about the forensic evidence that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. The boy's coerced words. At Brendan's trial, his own lawyers, barely fought for him. They allowed his coerced confession to be played for the jury without adequately explaining how investigators had manipulated a disabled child. They failed to present evidence of his intellectual limitations. They essentially threw a 16-year-old boy to the wolves. The verdicts that broke hearts. Steven Avery, guilty. Life in prison without parole. Brendan Dassey, guilty. Life in prison with possibility of parole after 41 years. Two men destroyed by the same corrupt system. One who had already lost 18 years to their lies, now condemned to die in prison. Another who was still a child when they caged him, who may spend his entire adult life paying for words that were put in his mouth by the very people sworn to protect him. The convictions of Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey should have been the end of the story. Two inconvenient men silenced, $36 million in liability eliminated, careers protected. Case closed. But then came Making a Murderer. Netflix's documentary series exposed the corruption to millions of viewers worldwide. People who had never heard of Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, were suddenly experts on prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption. The case that local authorities thought they had buried exploded into international controversy. The response was swift and vicious. Prosecutors attacked the documentary as biased. Law enforcement officials claimed they were the real victims. The very people who had destroyed two lives now complained that their reputations were being damaged by the truth. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. New evidence, same corruption. Steven's new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, has uncovered evidence that further exposes the frame-up. Computer records showing someone else had been stalking Teresa, cell phone data contradicting the state's timeline, forensic evidence proving the blood was planted, witness testimony revealing police coercion. Brendan's legal battles. Federal courts have repeatedly ruled that Brendan's confession was coerced and his conviction should be overturned. But Wisconsin fights every attempt to free him, spending hundreds of thousands in taxpayer money to keep a wrongfully convicted man in prison rather than admit they tortured a confession out of a disabled child. The system that refuses to bend, despite overwhelming evidence of their innocence, despite international attention, despite court rulings in their favor, both men remain in prison. The system that framed them continues to fight their freedom with the same viciousness they once used to convict them. Today, Steven Avery sits in Waupun Correctional Institution, serving life without parole for a murder he didn't commit. He's 62 years old, having spent 35 of his 62 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. 35 years stolen by a system that values its reputation more than justice. Brendan Dassey, now 34, remains in Columbia Correctional Institution. He was 16 when they caged him. He spent more than half his life in prison for words that investigators put in his mouth. His intellectual disability means he may never fully understand why the nice police officers who promised to help him instead destroyed his life. The Avery family has been shattered. Steven's parents, Dolores and Alan, have aged decades watching their son and grandson disappear into the machinery of a corrupt system. His siblings live under the shadow of a case that made their family name synonymous with murder. Teresa Halbach's real killer walks free. Her family believes justice was served, not knowing that the men convicted of her murder are as much victims as she was. The real perpetrator remains at large while two innocent men rot in prison for his crime. How does the same police department that frames a man for rape get to investigate him for murder? How does a key appear in a bedroom after 7 searches by the very officers being sued by the suspect? How does blood with no fingerprints end up in a victim's car in a pattern that defies physics? How does a bullet fragment with the victim's DNA appear in a garage 4 months after multiple searches found nothing? How do trained investigators extract a confession from a disabled teenager without recording the crucial first 2 hours of interrogation? How does a confession that contains no details only the killer would know become the cornerstone of a murder conviction? How does a system that claims to seek justice fight so hard to prevent DNA testing that could prove innocence or guilt definitively? And most damning of all, how does a country that prides itself on justice allow 2 innocent men to rot in prison when the evidence of their innocence is overwhelming? The Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about American justice. It's not about guilt or innocence. It's about power. It's about who has it and who doesn't. It's about what happens when the people sworn to protect us decide we're the enemy. Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey had 3 strikes against them from birth. They were poor, they were uneducated, and they were inconvenient to powerful people. In America, that's often a death sentence, even if you never die. This case isn't just about 2 men in Wisconsin. It's about every innocent person sitting in prison because cops lied, prosecutors cheated, and juries believed the badge instead of the evidence. It's about a system so corrupt that it will destroy children to protect its reputation. It's about the choice we face as Americans. Do we demand justice, or do we accept that some people are expendable when it's convenient for those in power? Steven Avery spent 18 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit, then was framed for a murder he didn't commit. Brendan Dassey had his childhood stolen and his adulthood caged based on words that were put in his mouth through psychological torture. Both men remain in prison today, not because they're guilty, but because admitting their innocence would require admitting that the system failed catastrophically. It would require accountability from people who have never been held accountable. It would require justice in a system that has forgotten what that word means. Here's the question that should keep you awake at night, the question that exposes the rot at the heart of our justice system. If they can do this to Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey, frame them, torture confessions from them, plant evidence against them, and keep them caged despite overwhelming proof of their innocence, what makes you think they can't do it to you? Because here's the terrifying truth: Steven and Brendan weren't special. They weren't criminal masterminds or dangerous sociopaths. They were just ordinary people who became inconvenient to the wrong powerful people at the wrong time. They were people just like you. In Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, badges became weapons, evidence became fiction, and justice became just another word for whatever the powerful needed it to be. Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey are still in prison today, nearly 20 years after their wrongful convictions. They wake up every morning in a cage, knowing they're innocent, knowing the evidence proves their innocence, and knowing that the system designed to protect the innocent has instead become their jailer. So here's my question for you. If this can happen in America, if innocent men can be framed, tortured, and caged while the system fights to keep them there, then what exactly are we calling justice? And more importantly, when will we decide that enough is enough?